Elias unlatched the stable door, and there she was, a woman curled in the damp straw. Her black hair spilled across the ground like ink, blood dried around her hips, dress torn, and breath flickering low, like a flame about to give out. She didn't belong here, not to this winter, not to this stable, not to anything that had ever existed in his shuttered world. But she was alive. And that fragile fact reached somewhere deep in a man who'd long believed his heart had withered and gone. He didn't ask her name, didn't need a reason. All he knew was, after so many seasons of grief, this was the first time Elias had carried someone home. New Mexico. Late winter, 1884, the morning wind swept across the plains like it was dragging forgotten dreams behind it. Not cold enough to bite skin, but enough to make a man bow his head, hunch his shoulders, walk slower. The sky hung low in a leaden gray, not bearing snow, just thick and heavy like a word left unsaid. Elias Whitlow pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his frame, boots sinking into the cracked, frozen ground. He had risen before the sun. He hadn't counted days in a long while. There was no one left to share them with. Just prairie grass, splintered wood, and memory. In the cracks of every step, in the creak of the barn door, lived a trace of the boy he used to be, but now only the shadow remained. He was headed to the stable to check the water trough. The wind had shifted overnight, the kind of shift that cut straight through the bone. The horses stood still as statues, silent, watching. But something was off. Not a voice. Not quite an animal sound either. Just the faintest murmur, like the earth breathing out a warning. Elias opened the barn door. Damp straw, iron, and something else hit his nose. Blood. Not fresh, but present. Dense. Metallic. He stepped inside, unhurried. His eyes had long grown used to darkness, same as they had grown used to the solitude in his chest. And there, near the rear door, something broke the pattern. A figure. A streak of black hair sprawled like spilled ink across the yellowed straw. And then, red. Elias didn't speak. Whatever surprise he felt was muffled behind a wall built of too many winters and too many graves. He knelt. Old gloves touched a too small shoulder, then a cheek gone cold. A woman. Skin darkened by the sun. Her dress was torn down one side. Blood, thick and crusted, clung to her left hip. Eyes closed. Not unconscious, not entirely. He could see her chest still rising. Barely. Like the last flicker of a flame about to die. She didn't belong here. Not to this winter, this stable, or the silence that had ruled his life for years. But she was here, and alive. Fragile. Like a final match held in a freezing hand. Elias lifted her. She was lighter than he'd expected, or maybe he'd just forgotten the feel of another soul leaning into his bones. Her hair brushed his wrist, cold, damp, and laced with smoke. Without a word, he carried her back to the cabin. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a stove, a table with 2 chairs that had never been used at the same time, a single bed, and a dirt-colored quilt older than the roof. No pictures, no music, just the things a man needed to survive, and a few to keep from losing his mind. He laid her on the bed. His hands moved clumsily through gestures that had gone unused too long, unlacing boots, cutting away torn fabric, wiping dried blood with warm cloth. He found the wound, a deep gash along her side. Not a bullet, maybe a knife. Old, but untended. He didn't ask her name, didn't speak. She hadn't stirred. Elias boiled water, cleaned the wound with antiseptic from a bottle last opened the summer before, wrapped it with torn strips from one of his shirts. She moaned, softly once, and then slipped back into silence. He kept the fire through the night, dozed in the wooden chair, never quite asleep. Near dawn, he dreamed someone called his name, in a tongue he didn't understand, but somehow his heart answered. The rain hadn't come, but the air held its damp promise, as if the gray clouds above were waiting for just one sorrowful word to break open. Elias stood at the stove, stirring a thin broth more out of habit than hunger. Motion, after all, kept the mind from circling too long around old ghosts. In the cabin, the woman's breathing came soft, quieter than smoke. Each time she moaned, Elias looked up, eyes locked on the damp patch along the shoulder of the quilt, watching her arm twitch with fever. That, he understood. The trembling of a body clinging to life, even when the heart might be ready to quit. He'd tended the fields like that once, when the frost came early, when the soil cracked wide for lack of rain, when seedlings broke ground only to wither in the hot wind. That kind of patience wasn't something he'd been taught. It was carved into him by time, by loss, by long seasons alone. He laid a cloth across her brow. When it cooled, he swapped it for another, warmed gently, wrung by hand. His touch was careful, as if anything heavier might shatter her. She spoke in fevered murmurs, not many words, but they drifted like wind. Not English, not the Spanish some townsfolk used when trading salt. Maybe Apache, an old strain, low and deep, like stone dropping into a cave. Elias didn't understand a word, but he listened anyway. She didn't call out for anyone, didn't beg or cry, just fragments, like a song with the melody stripped away. Once, she repeated something 3 times, emphasizing the last syllable, eyes closed tight. Sahale. Elias echoed it back, gently, as though catching something that had almost slipped beyond the edge of the world. She didn't answer, but after that, her breath seemed steadier. He wasn't sure if it was her name. Could have been a child's, or her mother's, or some faraway place she'd meant to return to. But in his mind, Sahale took root, like the name of a tree no one had ever planted, but had grown all the same. The next morning, the rain came, a light rain, hesitant, as though the sky didn't want to trouble the earth too much. Elias cracked the door, letting the damp drift inside. The stove had gone out sometime in the night. The firewood was wet and slow to catch. He knelt by the hearth, coaxing embers with strips of old butcher paper. When he turned around, she was awake. This time, truly awake. Not fully lucid, perhaps, but her eyes, dark and deep as wet ash, were seeing. Not the wild, lost look from before. No, this was the look of someone who knew exactly where she lay, and more importantly, knew she didn't belong there. She stirred. Elias raised a hand, not to touch, just to signal. "Stay," he said. She paused, not out of fear, but consideration, like a fox weighing its escape, not out of trust, but because there was no clear way out. Elias poured water, brought the tin cup to her. She lifted a hand, slowly. He didn't help, but held the cup steady until her fingers took hold. One sip, then another. She drank cautiously, like someone not yet convinced that water was still water. After a while, she exhaled. "Sahale," she said again, clearer now. Elias nodded. Didn't question it, didn't need to. He tapped his chest, just above the place where heartache once lived, and pointed to himself. "Elias." She closed her eyes, a long blink, as though accepting the name was a quiet bargain, not trust, but not rejection either. He said it again, slower, Elias. She didn't repeat it, but she didn't turn away. For hours afterward, the cabin held the hush of stone, rain tapping the roof, occasionally the drip of water into the barrel out back. Elias sat at the table, carving a stick into the rough shape of an animal, not that he could say which. Maybe a badger, maybe a dog with a short tail. Sometimes his hands trembled, not from cold, but from a memory of small fingers once snatching the carving knife, laughing when the tail snapped clean off. He set the carving near her bedside, said nothing. That afternoon, returning from the stable, he found her turned toward the window, eyes open, watching the rain as if looking through it, into a memory that lived beyond the reach of this land. She reached out, slowly, touched the carving, didn't speak, but kept it with her. That night, Elias sat beside the bed like a sentry without a rifle. The fire crackled low. Their shadows stretched across the log walls. Two strangers, bound into a story someone else had started, then abandoned. She slept again. Fingers curled around the carving, breaths steadier, fever waning. Elias stepped outside, beneath the overhang, cradling the hunting rifle he polished every Sunday. No one out there, but he felt the land shifting beneath his boots. When he returned, Sahale was watching him. She didn't ask, didn't speak. But between them now, there was a new kind of pact. If danger came, it would come for both of them. The fire whispered. Wood cracked. Elias sat down in the chair beside her bed. Didn't touch her. Didn't say a word, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Sahale moved as if she had never fallen. Not tentative, not uncertain, just slow, steady steps that made no apologies. In those early days, she would sit for hours by the window, her thin hands wrapped around a tin cup of warm brew Elias made from the frost-scented silver leaf he'd picked behind the cabin. She never asked the name of the plant, just drank, as if she knew it had once kept someone breathing through the cruel tail end of winter. Elias spoke no more than was needed, but he watched, and what he saw was this. Sahale wasn't just alive, she was remaining. She folded the blanket she had slept on, set her worn boots neatly against the wall. Every small motion seemed like stitching back together a space long unraveled. This cabin, which hadn't felt lived in for years. Elias wasn't wrong. After so many seasons of nothing but crackling embers and sighing wind, the room had begun to breathe again. On the 6th morning after the rain, he found her out on the porch, tying strips of wood to the crossbeam. Not for decoration, for drying herbs, long, slender leaves, sharp sweet with the scent of green sap. She'd cut them from the edge of the woods and carried them home in silence. Never asked if she was allowed, and he didn't stop her. Only once did he speak, when he set a fresh log by the stove and she instinctively pulled back from the swirl of old ash. Just the remnants, he said softly. Won't burn again. She looked at him, wordless, then crouched, brushed her sleeve over the ashes like someone tending the burial ground of a dream. It happened that afternoon. Elias had been out east, checking the trough and pulling weeds near the fence line. He was bending a cracked plank when the scent caught him. Smoke. Not from the stove. No pine in it. This was harsher, rushed, thick as a red-hot blade sliding into bone. Elias rose, his shadow long and worn into the land like a pillar ground down by time. From the ridge beyond the pasture, he spotted the smoke, narrow, deliberate, curling up like a whispered threat. A strip of fire licking at the northern edge of the grass. It didn't spread, but it was enough. Someone had lit it, Not to destroy, to signal. When Elias returned, Sahali was behind the cabin clipping wild greens. She didn't look at him, but her hand hesitated as the wind shifted. "Fire," she said, voice low as midnight. Not a question, not surprise. Elias nodded. "Someone said it, North Edge." "Message," she murmured. "Not meant to burn." He didn't answer, took off his coat and hung it on the nail by the door. His hunting rifle, oiled that morning, lay quiet on the table, waiting like he was. Sahele glanced down at a fresh nick on her finger where a leaf had cut her. A small drop of blood welled. She brought it to her mouth, not from pain, but like a reminder that her body still belonged to this world. The next morning, hooves rang out from the south. Elias had risen early, fixing fence, nails by hand. He looked up at the dust rising. 5 riders, gray coats, collars turned high, faces shadowed beneath brims, but he knew the one in front, Lieutenant Burke. The name had echoed around the relay station 2 seasons back, a man who hunted Apache remnants like he was chasing veins of gold. No official badge, but the kind of authority that came from fear, not law. Burke halted his horse at the fence, smiling with no warmth. "Mr. Whitlow," he said, peeling off his gloves. "Just a small question today." Elias didn't invite him in, didn't reply, just leaned lightly against the post. "Seen anyone strange out this way? A native woman, possibly wounded, possibly dangerous, or..." Burke tilted his head. "Maybe just lost." Elias shook his head, slow. "Only thing lost here is the wind." Burke raised a brow. "We've reason to believe she's carrying something important. Not a weapon, something else. A secret, a map, a way through." Elias said nothing. Burke gave a dry chuckle. "Her father used to guard the Western Canyon. He's dead now. She's the last one who remembers the path, and we need that path." "What for?" Elias asked. "Whatever your ancestors buried," Burke said, "and whatever we've got a right to dig up. Gold, maybe. Water, maybe. Or just belief. That's worth a damn, too." Elias's grip tightened around the fence rail. "No one here but me and a few horses. If you find anything else, might be your imagination." Burke smirked. "I've learned not to trust imagination, but I believe in fire." He turned his horse. "Next time the blaze is bigger, you'll know who's calling." Elias returned coated in red dust. Sahale was at the stove, boiling water. "Burke," she said without turning, "you knew. The wind carries his stink. He came to our village once, when I was small, smelled like old fire and burnt grease." Elias poured water, placed the cup beside her. Neither reached for it. "They'll come back," she said. "Next time they won't ask." Elias nodded, his gaze sharp as the axe blade he honed at the start of every dry season. "We'll be ready." Sahale didn't ask ready for what. She just nodded, her eyes no longer shadow but steel. That night, a new fire burned outside the cabin. A lantern hung from the rafters. Elias checked the rifle, the shells. Sahale folded dry cloth into bundles, fastened a small leather pouch to her belt, the only thing she'd carried when she fell into his stable. They didn't speak before bed, but something between them had changed. No longer just a guest and a keeper, but 2 people who knew. They would stand together when the fire swept across the grass. The rain began just as the fire in the stove softened. It didn't pour, didn't lash like a storm. It came quiet, persistent, like someone drumming fingertips on the cabin roof out of memory. Elias added a log, tilted his head to listen. The crack of sap inside pinewood, the steady drip of water on the timber above. There was a hush to the night, as if the land itself had gone still. waiting for something to be spoken aloud. Sahale sat apart from the fire, no blanket, no knife or needle or task in her hands. Her palms rested on her knees. Still, her eyes looked toward the flame, but not at it. She was staring through it, as if inside that wavering orange glow was another world, long gone. Elias didn't ask, but he knew. She was going to speak, not out of pressure, not in search of comfort, but because when someone has survived long enough, silence becomes too heavy to carry alone. After a long while, she said, "People always think Burke wants gold." Her voice was rough, like cooled ash. "He's not stupid. He just believes if a place has been kept secret that long, there must be something worth taking." She gave a faint smile, not bitter, not mocking, just the kind that folds a person away from the story they're about to tell. Stone Root Cavern holds no gold. It holds life. And Burke can't see the value in life unless it's got a price tag. Elias sat on the edge of his chair, fingers laced, head bowed slightly. The fire cast his shadow long across the wall, making him look like a different man, older, quieter. The man I called my grandfather? Not by blood, but because he guarded things no one else had the patience to guard, was the last keeper of the path into the cave. It runs deep, roots poking out like bones. That's why we called it the Root Cave. Inside, she continued, grows a plant unlike any I've seen. The leaves are thin as cicada wings, but warm to the touch. Steeped in water, they break fever, heal wounds. Some call it spirit-blessed. Others believe our ancestors sowed it before they passed. Burke caught wind of it from a man who fled the prison camp, someone our village once saved. He came bearing gifts, salt, sheep hides, rusted rifles, but his eyes stayed fixed on the mountains. My grandfather never told, not when they tied him up, not when they beat him. He died silent, and I. Her voice didn't falter, but the pause said more than words. I saw it, saw the way Burke kicked his head in, heard the crack, like dry corn husks snapping. She stopped. Wind slipped through the doorframe, like a sympathy no one dared speak aloud. I ran, took a piece of hide with the map scratched on it. It burned when Burke torched the tent, but the path, I remember. Not because I'm clever, she added, eyes still fixed on something beyond Elias, but because I was the last to walk it with him. Elias couldn't lift his face for a moment. Not from fear or shame or guilt, but because something in his chest drew tight. Not pity, not anger, a kind of awe at how survival could wear such a quiet shape. A girl with no declarations, no scars shown off, yet carrying the weight of a torn-apart history. When he finally looked up, her gaze met his. He spoke, barely above a whisper. I thought. I was the last one alive out here. She didn't reply, but her expression softened, just enough for the firelight to catch the glint of water in her eyes. Elias braced against the table, stood, turned away. Didn't want her to see. Too late. The tear hit the floor, slow, heavy, like it belonged to no one. Just proof of something words could never hold. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire dimmed. Rain tapped gently above, coaxing the cabin into sleep. Sahale reached for a small log, placed it in the stove. Her scarred hands didn't tremble. She moved with the care of someone tending kin, something once hers, something that could be Elias's too. They won't stop, she said finally. Burke will come, not for gold, but because he doesn't know how to lose. Elias nodded. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve, didn't say a word. But when he turned back to her, his gaze wasn't just agreement. It was a vow. "Does anyone else know the trail?" he asked. She shook her head. "Then wherever the fire goes," he said, "we go." And in that moment, the line between host and sheltered vanished. All that remained was one thing: survival, not for themselves, but for what they were guarding. A piece of this world not yet ruined. No one said anything, but from that morning on, the cabin began to change. Not with thunder or blood, just small, quiet shifts, like grass growing back after fire. Elias rebuilt the east fence, not because the horses had wandered, but because something deep in his gut told him that sooner or later, something would come from that way. Sahali didn't ask. She unspooled yucca cord into thin threads, wove traps beneath the low brush, planted jagged rocks along the worn trail, not to harm, but to buy a few precious seconds if the ones coming weren't kin. At first, they worked alone, but every task left space for the other to step in. Every movement became a silent invitation. The clearing behind the barn filled with overlapping footprints, Elias's, steady as a man who'd carried war through his bones, Sahale's, light as a breeze through cedar, but pressed deep like roots in stone. There were no blueprints, no maps, just two people moving toward the same thing, where life might still take hold. And from scattered routines, a fortress began to rise. Sahale taught Elias how to hear hooves in the wind, sounds swallowed by the prairie unless you knew how to stop breathing long enough to notice. Elias taught her how to load a Winchester in the dark, one hand steady, not to kill, but to endure. She stitched a field kit from old cloth and left it near his bedroll, no explanation needed. He split a strip of deer hide, wove it into a plain knot, and left it on the windowsill where she always sat at dawn. Neither said it was for the other, but both kept theirs close. There were no tender gestures, no hands held in sleep, no names whispered through the dark. Just quiet acts, repeated, like the steady pulse of a heart neither of them had yet dared name. One day, under a sky the color of damp ash, Elias was stacking wood when he found a hawk feather tucked into the brim of his old hat. No string, just slid through the strap with deliberate care. He didn't ask, didn't pull it free. That evening, as the wind brushed across the ridge, the feather quivered, like a silent nod toward something that had just been accepted. On clear nights, they trained on the rise behind the barn. Elias lined up tin cans, stepped back just far enough to force a deeper breath. Sahale took the rifle, her hands still unsure, but her gaze steady. He showed her how to tuck the butt to her shoulder, let it rest against the bone, not bite. How to breathe in, then out, and squeeze the trigger like letting go of a fear you no longer needed. She missed twice. On the third shot, the can dropped. No applause. Just silence between them, giving the echo room to fade. When he handed her the next round, she didn't take it with her hand. She took it with her eyes, and held his longer than before. Every corner of the cabin began to bear the mark of them both. A new hook for the knives, nailed near the stove, just above her reach, but always with a stool beneath it now. A round, black stone, smooth as a crow's egg, sat by the window. Not decoration, but a reminder that some things shouldn't be forgotten. They slept in separate spaces, she on the guest cot he'd built long ago, he near the hearth on the chair that groaned when he shifted. But every night, she left a warm bowl of water beside him. And every morning, he folded the blanket she used to block the wind that crept through the walls. Actions ahead of need, as if each of them had begun to live inside the other's thoughts. When a gust knocked down the southern fence, Elias didn't sigh like usual. He looked toward the doorway, where Sahale stood mending her sweater with a wooden needle. They locked eyes for a beat. No one said, "We'll fix it," but by dusk, they'd set 4 new posts, ringed the base with stones, and planted cactus along the final row. Not to stop anyone, just to warn them. One evening, they sat on the porch. Wind gentle, fire inside gone quiet. Elias said, "I used to think I didn't need anyone. Just land and silence." Sahale didn't turn, but her voice came as part of the night. Even silence needs someone to keep it with. Elias gave a soft laugh, not sad, not joyful, just the kind of laugh that comes when a man finally understands. Silence, when shared, loses nothing. The fortress they built had no watchtowers, no flags, just a low roof, sturdy fences, and 2 people who wouldn't flinch and wouldn't run. Whatever was growing between them didn't arrive with glances or vows. It came with presence, steady, unshaken, like a fire in the stove, not roaring, but always enough to warm the hands. And in the rhythm of each breath, they began to hear one another. Not through words, but through a trust that had no name yet. The wind turned while it was still dark. It didn't arrive with a howl or fury, but with an absolute silence. The prairie held its breath. No birdsong, no stirring grass. The air paused like it does before a blow no one can stop. And in that hush, Elias opened his eyes. He heard nothing, but his body, seasoned by battlefields, sensed something crawling toward them. Slow, deliberate, irreversible. Sahale was already awake. She didn't ask, just stood at the window, fingers curled around her bow, shoulders drawn straight like timber in a storm. Elias looked to the horizon. A line of dust rose, thin as a held breath. 12 horses, swords and rifles glinted in the first light. Burke had returned. They didn't speak. There was no need. Everything worth saying had already passed between them in the days they survived together. In the worn leather band around Sahale's wrist. In the hawk feather tucked into Elias's old hat. Elias pulled the Winchester from its shelf. Sahale slung her quiver across her back. Each stepped into their place without turning back. The little cabin had become an extension of them. Each door, each stone, each creaking board now a part of memory, a choice made long before this moment arrived. Burke came like a man already certain of victory. He stopped his horse at the southern fence, where Sahale had scattered loose gravel just deep enough to sink hooves and slow the charge. "Still not dead, Whitlow?" Burke called out. Elias didn't answer. He was already behind the barn's curve, where he dug a shallow trench and disguised it with dry scrub. Hands steady on the rifle, eyes locked. They thought this was just a cabin, but solitude had always been Elias's armor, and now it was his edge. Burke gave the signal. His men spread out, 3 straight toward the house, 4 to the barn, 5 climbing the ridges to higher ground. They saw no one. No door swung open, no chimney smoke, only wind, cold, heavy, and the scent of old ash. The first shot cracked from the ridge behind the house. One soldier dropped from his saddle, bullet in his back, dead before he hit dirt. The second fell just as he reached for the barn latch, shot clean through the chest. He folded like dry leaves. Yells rang out. The rest surged toward the cabin. Sahale fired. The arrow tore through the air, sunk deep into the thigh of the man carrying firecrackers. He screamed, rolled into the ditch. She didn't stop, slipped behind a chestnut tree, reloaded, moved like a shadow, swift, silent. Elias shifted between 3 firing spots, his aim deliberate. The soldiers panicked, unsure where the shots were coming from. The ground beneath them betrayed their footing, slick, unstable. One fired blindly, his shot thudding into a fence post where Elias had stood seconds earlier. Elias didn't flinch, moved again, fired twice more, vanished. Burke rode hard into the center of it all, furious. "I know you're here, Whitlow," he roared. "One bullet's all it'll take. You can't save that little savage." His voice clanged through the air like steel on stone, but the cabin remained still. He aimed toward the porch, where he guessed Elias waited, and pulled the trigger. No shot returned, only the twang of a bowstring. An arrow shot through the sky, too fast to see. It struck his shoulder, twisting his aim. Burke's bullet missed, shattering a stone behind the fence. Elias rose, only for a moment. The Winchester nestled against his ribs. The final shot broke from his barrel just as his lungs emptied. The bullet struck Burke clean through the chest. No scream, just the weight of his body toppling from the saddle, like a tree that had been dead a long time, finally cut down. The rest of the soldiers scattered, without command, without plan. They no longer knew where the enemy lay or who they even fought. They had no orders now, only fear. The wind swept the valley. Hoofbeats faded into distance. Sahale emerged from the woods, unwounded, sweat at her collar, but eyes bright. Elias stood in the clearing, chest heaving, rifle slack in his hand. They looked at each other. No smile, no embrace. But in that look, something was exchanged. Not "you're alive," not "you saved me," but something quieter, deeper. "Now we are truly one." That night they burned the bodies, not for revenge, for closure. Elias shoveled ash into the pit. Sahale lit a bundle of herbs, letting the smoke guide spirits off the land, not as a friend, but as a sentinel. When all had stilled, Elias sat on the step. She came beside him, said nothing, just sat close. His hand, for the first time, touched hers. No tremble, no permission, no need for it. Sahale leaned, resting her shoulder against his, and in that prairie night, full of wind but free of noise, there were no vows, no dreams spun, only this truth. In the heart of battle, love had found its ground, without a name, without proof, just two people, alive, together. After the battle, there was no cheering, no victory, only silence. Elias and Sahale dug graves with bare hands, though the earth was still cold and roots ran deep. They didn't bury men like enemies, but like shadows finally laid to rest. Each handful of soil closed over something scorched, some memory burned down to ash, some sentence no longer in need of judgment. When the burying was done, they gathered pine branches, tree resin, and aged leaves, built a fire just warm enough, not blazing, not boastful. Sahale lifted the ashes in both hands, casting them to the wind, singing as she scattered. The song wasn't long, and it wasn't mournful, but its melody rose like something older than sorrow, something that had lived longer than flesh, longer than vengeance. It was her people's song, a chant to carry the spirit home, back to mountain, to water, to wind. Elias didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He stood beside her, still. And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man looking in from the outside. After the ritual, they sat together on a ledge above the valley. The wind swept through like an old friend returned, not threatening, not bitter, just gentle, asking how they'd been. Elias pulled a small knife from his coat, the handle worn smooth with time. He carved a line into a piece of wood, 7 tallies, one for each day since she arrived. and beside them, a single straight mark. Not to end something. To begin. He turned toward her. Didn't speak. Sahale looked down at her hands, still dirt-stained, then lifted them slowly, reaching toward him. He took her hand. Not tightly. Not with a tremble. Not to hold her back, but to move forward together. The next day, Sahale led him up the eastern ridge, where she had hidden through that first winter, after her people were massacred. At the summit, among stone and moss, sat a flat patch of earth. There she had stacked a small cairn, one stone atop another, all by hand. No cement, no forcing, each one a soul remembered. She placed one final stone, smaller, darker, smoother than the rest. It was hers. She wasn't hiding anymore, not surviving as a remnant, but standing as a witness to existence, to memory, and to love. Elias stood beside her while she sang the same song again, this time softer, almost a whisper. She didn't look at him, but when it ended, she didn't leave. That night, as they returned to the cabin, Elias opened the door without turning to see if she followed. He didn't have to. He knew. She had chosen to stay. They didn't speak of love. They spoke of wood needing chopping, of where the creek bends in late spring, of how the birds had returned earlier than usual. But some mornings, Elias would find fresh bread near the hearth, still warm, wrapped in cloth. And some nights, Sahale would come back from the woods with herbs she tucked into his palm, silently, like medicine she trusted him to know how to use. She didn't try to change the house. She lit the lamp lower, swept the floor softer, touched the walls with eyes that didn't flinch at their emptiness. One evening, she set a small stone carved with her people's sigil on the mantel. She didn't ask. He didn't stop her. And somehow, the house didn't feel any smaller, just fuller. On the sixth night, rain came. Not the harsh kind that breaks branches, but the kind that sinks into soil, slow and needed. The roof creaked. The wind sang through the chinks. Elias placed an extra log on the fire, turned, but Sahale was already there, a blanket over her shoulders, hair damp with mist. She looked at him, really looked. Not with fear, not even with thanks, but with something quieter, a question, a threshold. He didn't cross it with words. He crossed it by stepping closer, lifting his hand, not to pull her in, but to brush away the single drop of water hanging at the tip of her brow. She leaned forward, not quickly, not as surrender, but as choice. And in the hush of rain and pine and flickering flame, their foreheads touched. No kiss, no urgency. Just the stillness of two people who had finally stopped running. Later, in the dark, Elias reached for her hand, placed it over his chest. That place where, for years, there had been only emptiness. Sahale didn't pull away. She let it rest. Outside, the wind moved soft. The crows flew home. And the small house, once a fortress against the world, had become simply a shelter. A place where two broken souls, without fanfare or promise, had begun, inch by inch, to learn how to live again. If this story made your heart pause for a beat, leave a word in the comments for the things that never had names. Like if you still believe in the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Echoes, where the quietest hearts finally get to be heard.